Okay, welcome. I am Suzette Halterman. I am here with Chris Rich and Brooke Booth for another panel discussion where we bring our different personal and professional experience to address topics related to navigating mixed faith marriages, which can be very difficult. And every mixed faith marriage is different. And we don't have the answers for you, but we hope that our conversations generate some ideas for you to help you navigate your own journey, your own mixed faith marriage situation. So today's topic is adaptability and flexibility in your mixed faith marriage. And this kind of came out of our last discussion about tithing. And we kind of realized like you can't really talk about navigating all these different topics in a mixed faith marriage without addressing the topic of flexibility and adaptability. So I want to jump right in, but I want to make it clear from the beginning. I think there's a misconception when we talk about flexibility that we're talking about just the believing spouse needing to be more flexible. And I want to be very clear from the beginning. This goes both ways. You can have very inflexible convictions, whether you're in the church or you're out of the church. So this is not targeted towards either side. This applies to everybody, for sure. So I wanted to be clear on that. Okay, and I want to jump right in, but I want to kind of introduce the topic with two things. And so the first is neuroscience that I find really interesting about flexibility and adaptability. And then the second is a quote, and then we'll jump in. So Dan Siegel, Dr. Dan Siegel is a neuroscientist, and he's done a lot of work around this, that flexibility and adaptability are actually indicators of health within an individual, but also within a system, a relationship system. So a brain with different parts integrating together is going to be flexible and adaptable. So rigidity, which is the opposite, is actually a sign of dysfunction, both within an individual brain and within systems of people. And I think that's fascinating. So this is not just our opinion here that we need adaptability and flexibility. This is the science is proving that this is actually an indicator of wellness within a person and in relationship systems. And I think that's fascinating. So here's a quote, and I could have pulled a quote from any couples expert because they all have their own ways of talking about this. I just kind of pulled a random one from an article about adaptability in relationships. It says, adaptability plays a pivotal role in our ability to navigate the ever-changing dynamics of human connection. It's the ability to adjust, evolve, and respond effectively to the varying needs, expectations, and circumstances that arise within these contexts. Whether it be in friendships, romantic partnerships, or professional collaborations, adaptability serves as a foundation for growth, understanding, and mutual respect. When individuals possess a high level of adaptability, they are more likely to approach relationships with an open mind and a willingness to learn and grow. This allows for deeper understanding of others' perspectives, leading to enhanced communication and the ability to find common ground, even in the face of differences. So I love that. Now, that's enough of me talking. I want to hear, what are your thoughts just on that quote or that information, the neuroscience bit, just to kind of get us jumped into this topic.
So I'll jump in. So this, I love what you said earlier, and I want to repeat it, is when I started to think about this idea, I'm like, oh, I bet most people are going to think we're talking to like the believing spouse, because they tend to get sort of labeled this way, especially when I talk to my clients. And as I thought more and more about it, I'm like, oh, this is a two-way street. Like, this is a two-way street. Change is scary, like regardless. And a lot of times when we're talking about adaptability and flexibility, we're talking about how one handles change. But what's interesting is change is scary, but so is staying the same. And so it can kick in from either direction. And I think a lot of the tension we look at here and that I'm thinking about as I was reading through this quote is the tension between staying the same and the tension between changing. And this certainly comes up in a mixed faith marriage. And sometimes one partner wants to change and change big things and change them fast. And another one wants them to stay the same. But again, that's more of a generic way of looking at it. This tension can present itself in so many ways, and it creates not just cognitive dissonance in yourself when you're experiencing change in this, but it can create sort of like couple cognitive dissonance, if you will. And it can certainly put people in like adversarial roles. And I'm fascinated as I've been thinking about this, about like the lack of adaptability and flexibility tends to create like this adversarial role where somebody's like hunkering down on like, this is how it has to be. And the other person is like hunkering down on like, this is how it has to be. And whether that's change or not, like you can hunker down on change just as much as you can hunker down on the status quo. And that's such an interesting, challenging dynamic of when people start hunkering down, as I call it, filling sandbags, digging in, double downing. This is anybody who's had this experience in their marriage knows this isn't helping anything. So neuroscience, great, love it. Yes, it's like real lived experience. We're like, yeah, that stuff doesn't work.
So yeah, I love everything that you guys have been saying. When I read the quote, I was thinking lately I've really been learning a lot about resiliency and how I think that's what resilience is being able to adapt and to change and to be flexible. I think of if you think of a tree in nature, if you have a tree that's in a really windy environment where it's always being blown, it is going to learn to like the actual cell structure of the tree changes, and it enables that wind, and that enables the tree to become more flexible and adaptable. And also it helps I'm not a tree expert, but so I've heard that, and it helps the roots to go down, so it can be that wind helps it to be more flexible. And I think um and I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but I think I definitely was not very flexible. And I'm thankful that my mixed faith marriage and relationships with my kids, I am definitely changing. That wind is helping me to be more flexible and adaptable. So I'm thankful for that. It's kind of like you guys are probably too young for this. Do you guys know what weeble wobbles are?
Oh, yeah. I don't
I
think
don't
you're as
know.
young as you think I am.
I love so for anyone that's listening, a Weeble Wobble, it was a toy back in the 70s, I think, where it was like an egg-shaped toy that would the catchphrase they was so this they're little people and you could push them over and they would the catchphrase was
Hope they don't
Weebles,
fall down.
yeah, Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. So I think that's the being resilient and having that flexibility and adaptability. I can't say the word. I love that quote. So thank you.
I love just adding the word resiliency in. Like if you are flexible and adaptable, your relationship will be more resilient. And that is the goal right? We want it sustainable. We want long term. We want connection to last. And so I love that. So then why, I mean, that which leads into the next question of why do we need this resiliency? Why do we need flexibility and adaptability in a mixed faith marriage? Like if we don't have it, then what? Or, why is this so important? Particularly for mixed faith marriages.
So like the metaphor Chris uses, I think is good. There's so many metaphors we could bring into this, like example, this idea we're trying to describe. What I thought of is like, if something's too rigid, you put it under stress, it breaks. Like things that are too rigid break. If you can't be adaptive, it leaves you to rigidity and you break. Like I remember when I was taught sports as a kid, the coach is always like, bend your knees, bend your knees. I'm in yoga class. She's like, don't lock out your elbows. Don't lock out your elbows. Like you're always hearing this, like keep the joints flexible, keep it, don't want to lock it out. Don't want to be rigid because that's where the injury comes. That's where the breaking comes. And I think rigidity, like wanting to lock into something, often stems from fear. Fear of judgment, fear of not fitting in, fear of not doing it right, fear of messing up, fear of all sorts of things. And so we sort of lock in to be good and right and safe, and we get into rigidity. And then we double down and we dig in, and that's hard. Like that's why I think it's so common. Like that's why we need the flexibility. And I think that's why it's common to see the fear and the rigidity, but I think that's part of why we need it, because otherwise it's just gonna break.
And I think too, we sometimes we have our plan A we're very focused on plan A and what that should look like. And especially in a mixed faith relationship, that plan looks different. And so being able to see that there could be beauty and goodness in plan B. When we're so focused on plan A, then we miss everything that could happen in plan the goodness that could come up in plan B. So I think just that whole idea that that we had these expectations that it was going to look one way and now it doesn't. So it's like, now what? Now what I want to do. And I think it's so important because, and as a life coach, I'm going to tell you to let yourself feel those emotions that come, that grief, that sadness, the disappointment, all those different emotions that come up because it is different than we had planned. And then to figure out, so okay, so that what the plan we thought plan A was going to be like this and it's not. So now what? And that's where that flexibility and resilience really can be helpful.
I'm going to jump in again. Is like, that's what's so fascinating. What she's saying is so spot on, because this is also what the person having a faith transition experiences. What they thought was plan A is no longer plan A either for them. Like it's a two-way street there. And it's like this ability to be flexible and adaptable makes not just the faith transition more gentle, the mixed faith marriage more gentle, and like all the other stuff that's happening in your life more gentle.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think this is the make it or break it aspect of a mixed faith marriage. The more flexibility, and we'll talk about flexibility versus just accommodating and laying down and rolling over and being like, whatever you want to do. Like, that's not flexibility, but we'll talk about that. But the more flexibility you have, the more likely you can co-create something new. That's what you're doing in a mixed faith marriage. You're co-creating a plan B, C, and D, and all of those things. Because if you don't have flexibility, you can't do that. And it's a sink or swim kind of thing. Like, either you're gonna have to be flexible and adaptable, or else the relationship is not going to be sustainable in the long term, maybe short term, but that's the harsh reality. So I think this is really important. So let's talk about our own journeys within this, your own flexibility and adaptability. How have you learned to be more flexible and adaptable, or struggled with it, or your spouse, just whatever you want to talk about your own journey in this regard.
I'll go if you want me to go. So I'm going to just be very vulnerable. I was very, very rigid. That I think at the beginning of this, so my husband left the church. It's been about 20 years now. And I don't know that there was anyone more black and white than Chris Rich 20 years ago. And I'm still pretty black and white there, but I've definitely learned to be more flexible with that. Um, I it was kind of like, I am dead set. I am going to stay active in the church and I'm going to do it my way. And I'm going to need to fix you because you're doing it wrong. And that didn't go over very well. It didn't go over well at all with my husband. And I it was, so there I really argued with reality. I knew I wasn't going to change. And so the only way I could make this work is if I could fix him and change him. And, that, it was like, once again, having this rigid idea that there is a right way and a wrong way. That was very, very disconnecting for us. And I'm really looking back, I'm really thankful to my husband that he was patient with me, because it definitely was something that was very, very hard for me. I think too, I had to learn to get more comfortable in the gray, because there's so many things that aren't black and white. And that was really hard for Chris Rich's little black and white heart. And like, for example, Sundays, I was like, we don't do sports, we don't do birthday parties. Well, we live in Massachusetts, so that everyone does sports and parties on Sundays. And that was, it was just like, no, we are going to do it this way. We're going to do it my way. We're going to do it according to the plan I've always had. And I was very strict with that. And it took me some time to, and as my kids left the church later, I recognized that I my I would always say Sunday is my day of worship and our family day. Well, sometimes it looked like Chris Rich going to church and reading scriptures home by herself while my people were off doing stuff. And I recognized that, you know what, I had to learn to, and I still go to church every week, and those things are really important to me. And it looks a little different now. Now like it used to be my son would have a basketball game and my husband would take him and I didn't go. And then that didn't feel good either. So it was like asking, who do I want to be? This looks different than I thought, but do I really want to be the mom that's home by myself and not cheering my kid on? And for me, this is going to be different for everyone. But for me, that answer was no, I want to be there at his games and cheering for him. And I also, I've figured out how to make it work for me that I do go to my meetings and then I hang out with my family. And sometimes that looks different than what I thought it was going to. Sorry, that was long.
No, perfect. Beautiful.
I think probably this isn't going to be a surprise. Probably most of us raised LDS might be a little bit black and white because like I totally like I was very rigid too. I think because that's how we're taught to be. I don't know that it's even I don't know nurture or nature here. I think a lot of this is socialization. Um, I was certainly rigid, and I was rigid before my faith transition in the orthodoxy. I was the one who's like, we're there 15 minutes before sacrament meeting, and I was reminding people of Fast Sunday and scheduling the temple trips and praying and reading every day and doing that. And I always thought I was more inherently rigid than my husband. What's been so interesting as we've explored our mixed faith marriage and all sorts of aspects is I'm not actually. We're both rigid. Like we both just have different contexts where it presents.
Yeah.
And like for a while I was more rigid, in the religious realm, and then that changed, and like has his rigidities and I have mine, and it's been really interesting to like develop some awareness around that. Because for years I thought it was me, like it was a me problem. And it's a human problem in many regards. As far as flexibility, it's a skill I've been really working on, this like adaptability and being resilient and being able to not let things like knock me over and break me in two. And as I've stepped into that, I've had to like let go of so many rules because I'm such a rule follower. I love just tell me what to do and I'll just march. I'm like, reading scriptures every day. It's not a problem for me. I got that. That's an easy rule to follow. And I had to like learn to let go of the supposed to and the shoulds. And like Chris was saying, and like, what kind of life do I want to live here? How can I be in relation with these other people? How can I like make this work? And it takes some adaptability and creativity. And it takes some stepping out of the black and white supposed to, shoulds, have to, need to kind of thinking. I'll tell you this it's helped me so much just like relax a little bit more and enjoy my life. It's helped me so much as a parent. Like I could speak volumes, and when we do a parenting one, like this has helped me so much as a parent. To be able to just bring that fear down and that to just step more into parenting from a calmer, relaxed place. Could speak forever on that, but that's like my experience has been like, I'm actually both. Some situations I'm extremely rigid, and some situations I'm more fluid and adaptable, as is my husband. And just starting to understand sort of our triggers and our insecurities is super helpful.
Yeah, I by nature I'm a very uptight person. I'll join your rigidity black and white club. Like I love my schedules. Like me as a first time mom, I was a nightmare. I'm like a schedule everything. I do not go with the flow. I am very uptight. I'm very to lean into black and white. I come from a long line of anxiety in my family history. I'm very prone to being uptight. But my husband is quite the opposite. He, opposites attract. Like he is fine without a schedule. He doesn't care, he thrives on the opposite. like more spontaneity, not having a schedule. So if I think a huge part of why our mixed faith marriage was not like the transition kind of into a mixed faith marriage was not very rocky for us was because of my husband's flexibility and adaptability. He was kind of just like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be, but okay. And he is not a rule follower. He has always kind of rebelled against rules in his own way. So that part for him has been easy. So I'd say about 50% of our success is due to the fact that, if not 75%, is due to just his nature of being like, okay, whatever. And he does not hunker down on the church stuff. And then the other, 25% might be skill and communication, but that's a huge part just of who he is. So if it was reversed, if my husband had the faith crisis, it would have been a whole different story. Left to my own devices, guaranteed I would have hunkered down, particularly with the kids. Like you talking about sandbags, Brooke, my kids would have been the sandbags that I felt like I'm going to focus all my energy into making sure my kids stay on the straight and narrow and we are solid. Like Chris is raising her hand. That's totally
That's what
what
I
I would have
did. Yeah.
done. I can predict it. I know I would have hunkered down, filled my sandbags, and been like control freak about it. Like I'm going to control everything now to make sure nobody else leaves the boat. And I would have needed some major help to knock some sense into me and help me deal with my own anxiety and my own uptightness about all that. So luck, as luck had it, I was the one that shifted faith. So it wasn't nearly as, my husband just doesn't hunker down. That's just not him. So he does it, other ways, but so yeah, that's kind of my story.
Can I add one? I just thought of something. I remember my sweet dad, he's 90 years old. He came to visit once and I completely hunkering down. Like, if you're not going to teach our kids the gospel, then I'm going to do it for both of us. And they knew all the things. And I remember one time my dad came to visit and he said, I want to give you a little piece of advice. And my dad's not one to swear. I'm not either, but I think this is very appropriate. So, warning right here. He said, I want to share the 11th commandment with you. And that is, thou shalt not get too damn serious. And it's probably one of the best pieces of advice he's ever given me. And that was, I think that, yeah, being able to relax and to be more flexible. And it doesn't, if you think it has to work a certain way, it's really hard when it doesn't. So there's Bob Peterson's advice.
I love that. We could just end right there. That's perfect. Well, what makes some of us more serious, and what is it that makes some of us more rigid and less able to adapt and go with the flow and be so uptight and need to hunker down? Any thoughts about that?
I think this is part of what we're talking about is like people who are more prone to black and white thinking, and it looks like we're 3 for 3 here. I think like that's correlated to more rigidity. I think that's just how it is, and like where that comes from. I'll stand by what I said earlier, is I do think this is part of our socialization in the LDS church is, this is the one true church and no cafeteria approach. Like this is going to create a little bit of rigidity. And I don't mean that in a way to be like, shame on you, church, for doing that, but just like, okay, there's maybe a causal link here. I think but again, it shows up on both sides of the table here. Like the rigidity is like, yeah, the black and white thinking, and it can cause, like I even wrote wibbly wobbly. You are so welcome, Chris Rich. That is in my notes.
Isn't that great?
Like there's a lot of judgment against being like wibbly wobbly and flippy floppy and rocking the boat. Like there is judgment that we need to be like steadfast and immovable and stalwart at all times and never changing directions and exact obedience and all of this. That's part of what's baked into us. And it's unfortunate because it doesn't give us a lot of flexibility. Like our knees are locked and our elbows are locked instead of in a more relaxed position. But it spills over into the other side. Even though people have had faith transitions, they still hold on to that black and white version. And how can you support an institution that does that? They speak in like all or nothings. If it hurts me, it hurts all people. And if you believe that, I can't respect you again. These are like black and white approaches that you see in people who've had a faith transition. You know, my children will be harmed if they attend, just like I was. You know, they'll internalize the exact same way I internalize. This is black and white thinking. And it can take a lot of so much awareness to start to recognize your black and white thinking and to start to question it and move away from it. I mean, people can have a whole faith transition and still be locked, set into the black and white thinking. You're just questioning some things, just not others, and you're not questioning. And it's a very fascinating thing. But back to your question, why we're more rigid than others, I think sometimes we're taught. I think some people just have more anxiety in their body and in the way their brains are wired or the chemistry. But I'm kind of I think the society where we were raised in, certainly my family of origin, like a lot of that was like how I was supposed to be. That was a good thing. And as I learned that, I had to unpack
Well, yeah, I think it is interesting all that you shared. And when I think of Christ, I'm gonna be the church lady, but that's my job here. When I think of Christ, I'm guessing he wasn't super rigid. I think he was very loving and kind. And I mean, definitely he had his things that were important to him, but I think he was a pretty go with the flow, show up out of love kind of person. So I think a lot of it, I think we probably make that we just and I think a lot of it too is our personalities that go along with it as well. So that we identify like I'm a rule follower, I'm black and white, we label ourselves. So I think that that can definitely make us more, and calling ourselves rigid. It's like that's just the way I am, and not being open to look at that. Is that really true? Is that what I want to be?
Yeah, I love that. No, I agree. I think also knowing your history, your mental health issues. Like I said, I come from a family that has high anxiety and an OCD. So I have to be very aware that that is in my genetics. It's in my genetic code. I'm very prone to that. So I really have to watch that with myself and be working on that. Codependency by nature makes you inflexible. I read a statistic that in our generation, 80% of people are codependent, and it's probably higher for women. So there's a good chance that you're codependent, and codependency means your sense of well-being comes from something outside of yourself, like other people validating you, valuing you, liking you. So if your well-being comes from something outside of yourself, it by nature makes you not flexible because you're dependent. It's like a baby's not flexible because it can't feed itself, change its diaper, regulate its temperature. It's not flexible. It's totally dependent on something. So the more codependent you are, the less flexible you are to roll with things, adapt, pivot, adjust, because your well-being is dependent on things. So this is for the believer and the non-believer. If you're codependent, it's going to create a lot of problems in your ability to. So I think that's a really important piece of flexibility that is just important to know about yourself. So for time's sake, let's get into the what do we do about this? If we have time, I'll come back to some other questions, but let's focus on what do we do with this? If you are the one that's struggling to be flexible, if you know you're pretty rigid, and I think it's a spectrum, I think it's a continuum where you might be rigid about everything on one extreme end, or you might just be rigid and black and white about a few things. And then there's a healthy middle. And then kind of on the other side of the continuum is you're just like a doormat, okay, I'll do whatever you want. That's not healthy either. So if you kind of are in one of those extremes somewhere along the way, how can you work on your own capacity to be more flexible and adaptable in healthy ways?
I've got a couple thoughts on this. I think one of the big things is figuring out what do I want? What is my goal in my marriage? What is my goal with my kids? And then working backwards from there. What do I want out of this? And one of my favorite questions is just asking myself, do I want to build a bridge or do I want to build a wall right now? And is that going to help me reach that goal? Because some things it's just like, and I think too, it is also important for me to we want to recognize like there are certain things that I value that are very important parts of me because of my faith. And and there are some things that I'm willing to to negotiate a little bit, and there's some things that I'm not. That's just like these are deal breakers for me. So look, identifying those different things and knowing the things that I could be willing to change a little and the things that I'm not willing to change, and then figuring out working backwards from that, I think um, I think another thing that I think is helpful as well is how would I feel if my spouse did the same thing to me? So I think it's easy to be like, there will be no alcohol in our house. Well, what if they came in and said, there will be no prayer in our house? Like, how would I feel in that situation? And then learning to, like trying to see it from their point of view. I think that can be helpful.
I love that.
I love what the church lady has to say.
I know. Me too.
Thanks.
You know what I was thinking is that a lot of times we're rigid for like good reasons. Like there's a reason for our rigidity. It's like it's a protecting something. It's like sometimes when we talk about, if you think something's really life or death, you're gonna be rigid about that. And to not be rigid and to just be like, just chill out, this isn't serious, even though I think that's generally good advice, can be impossible to apply if you really hooked it into a life or death type of a reality. And with religion, a lot of times it literally is life or death, and we call it spiritual life and spiritual death. This is really common language. And so if something's really hooked into like your spiritual life or your spiritual death, that could very well be why you're rigid. That could be why there's so much rigidity. And it could be not just your spiritual life and death. If you're in the one having the faith transition, this could feel like your freedom like is tied into this, and that you're like in prison versus free. That's a very similar dynamic that can cause you to lock down, double down. And I think becoming aware of these things of like, why am I rigid? Like, what is it that I'm actually believing that's perpetuating this rigidity and feeding and fueling this rigidity? Really understanding that, I think, is important. And it's not an easy step. This is going to be a challenging step. This is where you might need to get a little support and to see what you can't see. But to really look at that and understand what's fueling your rigidity, for me in my own personal work, I've got to take a look at that before I can start to dismantle it. Because otherwise my body is going to be like, no, this is very serious. This is very dangerous. This is very, like, it's not going to be something I can just put down with a platitude or with a nice like idea. I've got to really understand it and realize that maybe I'm not in complete danger here, or maybe this isn't life or death, before I can start to believe that this isn't so serious, before I can start to believe that I can be flexible here because it's hurting my relationship, and that's valuable too. I sort of see it as like I'm like grasping so hard to something, and I've got to realize that I'm safe and I'm not going to plummet to my death before I start to like uncurl those fingers. For me, that's necessary work. Otherwise, why would I let go and then fall into a chasm? No, thank you. Right? Like there's oftentimes some work to be done, internal understanding and awareness to be done.
I totally agree. I think it's critical if you're noticing, I tend to be more on the rigid side, really exploring why, because it could be that you do have anxiety, scrupulosity, childhood trauma, religious trauma, anything that is locking you in for your sense of safety, and it's this protective strategy. So I totally agree. It takes a lot of inner work to find out the why, and then depending on the why will be the strategies for how to deal with it, right? If you're dealing with scrupulosity, the strategies are going to be different than if you're dealing with something else. And I think too, just recognizing if you're rigid on the non-believing side, where you're still in black and white thinking like the church is all bad, my kids can't have anything to do with the church. I can't have anything to with the church in my home. Like that's still black and white thinking. So I think just recognizing that maybe you just swung from one side of black and white thinking to the other, but without doing the work of really deconstructing your own thought patterns, your own anxieties, your own rigidity. So I think whether you're rigid on the believing side or you're rigid on the non-believing side, it still requires the work to really understand, maybe rethink your definition of God and good, and rethink your thought patterns. So much work to be done. So now
Wait,
what if,
Suzette, will you quickly define scrupulosity just in case someone doesn't know
yes.
what that means?
So it's basically religious OCD, kind of moral OCD, kind of compulsions around moral things being good. That's the general idea. I'm sure I didn't do that justice, but it's a form of OCD specifically tied to
Here's a
religion.
great
Yes.
example. If there's a certain young woman who's 13 and has no problem reading her scriptures every single day and praying every day, she might have a little bit of that going on, like case in point, because it's like it's there's the compulsion, there's the necessity. Now I saw it as a child as something that like I needed to do for my own salvation, but again, that's part of it is like the need to do what's necessary for your, instead of being like, oh, you know what? We were traveling all day. It's really late. I need to rest. It's like, no, I have to do this for my own salvation. It's just a little case study for those of you who might resonate
From your friend.
from somebody I might know
I have
very
this
quickly.
friend.
And a lot of people might not even realize they have that. So really getting some professional help if I'm rigid, I don't know why, to really evaluate that. But what if you feel like your spouse is the one who's rigid and it's impacting your relationship? Like my spouse will not give on Sundays. He will, or tithing, or like having our kids go every week. Like there's no middle ground. How do you deal with that?
I'll start off by saying, can't change them. This is something we talk about a lot in the coaching world. But what I like to do is I like to approach it. Can you develop some compassion and understanding for them so that you're not so rigid in meeting their rigidity? A lot of times when somebody's rigid, we just want to like take a truck and bust through that brick wall. That would be a rigid approach to a rigid approach. I may have tried that. So again, opening some compassion and realizing what's going on here isn't that they're just being a jerk, but that maybe they have some fears and some triggers that are going on here. The other thing I'll say is requests. You can ask for whatever you need here. And I think we underutilize our requests. You can ask them to be more flexible. You can ask them to understand why they're so rigid about this topic. You can ask them, why this matters to them so much. You can ask them to get some help because it's impacting your relationship. Like you can ask for all of these things. You can't make them change and you can't change their beliefs and you can't change their rigidity. But you can ask for things that you need. And if you think those things are needful, ask.
Amen. I love all that. I think too, having boundaries, boundaries first, if someone's telling you, you will do this or you will not do that, having those boundaries for yourself and they're making the request, but that doesn't mean that you have to follow that request, and figuring out who do I want to be? What do I value? What's important to me? And not letting that go. Being able to be flexible with that, but if there are things that you're not okay with that they're requesting of you, then to have those boundaries and like this is something that I'm not willing to change that.
Yeah, I think you got to dare to rock the boat. Like if something is not working, and then rocking the boat is not just I'm going to bring it up once and it didn't go well, so now I'm just going to like secretly complain about why the fact it's not working. Rocking the boat means rocking the boat. It means getting their attention and saying, this is really important to me. I want to sit down on Thursday night after kids go to bed and I want us to come up with a plan. And if that doesn't work, I want to meet with the counselor. Like this matters to me. And in the meet, like I am not okay in our current situation. Like that is rocking the boat, right? And really demanding like this matters to me. Let's figure this out. So you got to rock the boat to bring attention to it. And you might have to keep rocking the boat and it might get messy.
She froze, didn't she, Chris?
Yep.
But is the nature of creating change the way you're being rigid about this, and it works for both of us, or else like I am not, this is not. Oops.
So that you froze for a minute there.
Oh no.
Oh, but it looks like you're back, and it
Yeah,
looks.
you're back.
Okay. Sorry. I don't know where it cut off, but
We
you probably
heard
get the
you.
point.
We heard you. We got the point. Message received.
Yeah.
All right. So let's do, we're almost out of time. Let's kind of, the last thing I really wanted to talk about is what's the difference between being flexible and just being like passive and accommodating and kind of just rolling over and not really having a say. Any thoughts on that?
I think that one of my favorite questions that I love to ask myself is how can I show up as the person that I respect? So if I'm just, there are certain things that are really important to me that part of who I am, part of my belief system that, that I want that if I gave up, I wouldn't respect myself that same way. So figuring out what are those things? What are the things that are non-negotiable? Also, I like to remember that we talk about people pleasing. I think one of the easiest ways to think about people pleasing is that people pleasing is lying. You are not sharing what's really true for you. You're not being vulnerable. And 13th article of faith, we believe in being honest. So I think it's important that we figure out, like what is important to me? Do I want to be flexible about this? If this is something that is so important to me, we don't want to and I'm on either side. We want to be checking in with that because people pleasing is lying.
I want to follow up on that people pleasing, but because I think being that doormat, that people pleaser is a form of rigidity. I think it can be a very rigid position because like the rule you're following is I got to keep everybody happy at any cost. Other people go first. Other people's needs are more important than mine. Don't rock the boat is probably the primary rule that they're holding on to so carefully. Like I don't want to rock the boat. I can't rock the boat, which I think is really apt with what Suzette was saying earlier. When we're stuck in that, I think that's actually a very rigid way of looking at the situation. Rocking the boat is dangerous and bad. It's a false sense of calm. It's a false sense of connection. Really being truly flexible and adaptable is a totally different skill set altogether. This is somebody who has their sea legs. They know that the boat is meant to be rocked. They know that that's an important part of how boats function. And they're okay developing their sea legs. They're okay in situations where the people around them are developing their sea legs as the boat is rocked. This is adaptability and flexibility. And I think the people pleasing, the passive is more rigid. They're wanting the status quo to be preserved at all cost. And often that's the cost of their own well-being and the well-being of the larger community. But I see those things as totally different skill sets.
Yeah, I think a good indicator is whether you're being adaptable and flexible or if you're just being too accommodating and people pleasing is resentment. For one, resentment means I am just not having boundaries, a chip on your shoulder, like internal stories you keep playing in your head about how mad you are that you have to do this. Tallying, like, look at all the ways I'm giving and I'm accommodating and you're not, kind of justifying your position. All those things are indicators you're kind of on the side of accommodating instead of healthy flexibility. I think healthy flexibility and adaptability comes from a place of genuine, like, I care about you. I care about connection, and me doing some give and take on this is good for me. Like, that's really good for me. And to be in connection with you, and I care and I want, it's more of like genuine. And when I'm being flexible and adaptable from that place, I don't ever feel resentment. I just feel like love and like, I care about us. I care about give and take. It feels good to do this thing called relationship, and I don't feel resentful. So but I can easily slip into accommodating and then I feel resentful. So I have to really like bring myself back kind of into health.
I think one thing I want to add to what Brooke was saying too, we have this, I think it's important to me to be a peacemaker. That's something that I value. And it's okay for a peacemaker to also have inner peace. Sometimes we think I just have to give it all up, but I deserve to feel peace as well. I think that's an important part of peacemaking that we overlook.
Yeah, and I want to add to this too, because I think we're hitting up against something really important. This idea of being flexible and adaptable doesn't mean not bringing up issues. It doesn't mean just being like, oh, it's fine that that thing that wasn't fine just happened. That's not what we're talking about. The person who's flexible and adaptable is bringing up issues and putting them on the table in real time and saying like, this isn't working. This is concerning to me. They're communicating and willing to have those conversations very regular. And I think sometimes we think this is confrontational, and that's different. And that we try to avoid conflict, don't want to rock the boat. And so sometimes we think being confrontational is bad and dangerous and rocking the boat. That's going to lead to more the doormat, people pleaser approach. People who are adaptable and flexible, they're honest. Like Chris was saying earlier, they're saying, this isn't working. This is something that's not sustainable in this relationship. This is this is a need I have. This is a concern I have. Being adaptable is sometimes perceived as slightly aggressive or hostile. And I want to argue that it's not, that conflict is not a bad thing. It's just a sign of communication that often needs to happen. Name calling, derisiveness. Okay, that's a bad thing, but that's not happening in like the context that we're discussing here.
Yeah, good points. All right, let's just, we're out of time. Maybe just give, 15, 20-second, any concluding thoughts about flexibility, adaptability?
One thing that
if you
I
have
was
any.
thinking about, in the temple, we covenant to find joy and rejoicing in our posterity. And I have learned that in order to do that, I need to be a little more flexible and adaptable. Because if I'm going to do my part to keep my covenant, it looks different than I thought it was going to. And I think that is what Christ expects us to do. He didn't say to find joy and rejoicing if everything was perfect the way you want it to and everyone was doing certain things. It's just, how do I figure out to have joy? And I feel so much more joy when I can be more adaptable and flexible. And I feel like I can follow my Savior better when I do that.
Beautiful.
I like what Chris is saying. Here's my little 10 seconds is this does bring a level, because you're not having the resentment, you're not having the frustration build up. There is some window into joy and happiness and contentment by developing this skill. And I was talking to a therapist recently, and she said that what's most important for children isn't that their parents are together, it's that they have at least one happy parent. And it's such an interesting thing based on what Chris is talking about. And another reason to like embrace and allow this adaptability and flexibility is that it's good for us. It's good for our happiness, our peace, our stability. It's good for our children. It's good for the people around us.
Beautiful. I think my final thoughts are just relationships are about like, oh, this isn't working for you. Okay, how can we adapt? This isn't working for me. How can we adapt? Relationship work is about pivot, adjust, experiment, try new things. All of that's vulnerable, it's scary. This is hard stuff, but I think there's room for all of us to grow in that relationship aspect of adapting, adjusting, pivoting to co-create something together that works for us and is sustainable in the long term. So thank you, ladies. Wonderful thoughts.
Thank you. We'll see you next time.